Hi there. This is Angelo John Lewis for the Sacred Inclusion Network. And if you're unfamiliar with us, please go to our website and find out more about us, sacredinclusion.com. Essentially, we're a group of mostly unaffiliated spiritual seekers, and some of us wish to change the world, you could say. But in any event, please go to our website and you can learn more. Today, I'm honored to talk to Mark Argent, in advance of our special exploration that we're calling Spiritual Path Exploration. And I invited Mark especially to facilitate this because Mark has a lot of experience as a spiritual director in a variety of contexts. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. And this is just a spiritual direction aspect of Mark. Mark at one point worked at the St. Buenos Center of Ignatian Spirituality. And he was also the co-facilitator of the annual Exploring Spiritual Direction events at the Windermere Center in the United Kingdom. He's an elder in the United Reformed Church, a member of Spiritual Directors International, and he's been deeply influenced by his travels in Southeast Asia and his encounters with the spiritualities there. And his interests include the creative arts, psychoanalytically approaches to society, organizations, and politics, and group relations facilitation. Mark, hi, how are you?
Alive and kicking. It's nice to be able to chat with you today.
Thank you. You know, Mark, I think we should start with a real simple question because I don't know if people are familiar with this whole topic of spiritual direction. I wonder if you could define it.
I suppose as good a definition as any is one a series of conversations that help a person to develop and deepen their spirituality.
That sounds like a good, simple direction. No one can argue with that. You know, I'm going to ask you a little bit about this history, but I'm curious. So if people come to you or anyone who's a spiritual director, what sort of concerns do they have? What sort of questions do they have? What does that look like?
I hesitate to be too general because in a sense, it's always the chemistry of the individual coming and the individual spiritual director, but really a huge range of things. I mean, sometimes if someone's coming on a retreat, you might start with a basic question like, why have you come? Or what's prompted you to make contact for spiritual direction? So something very vague, and the idea of being vague is that actually with a little bit of luck, you begin to home in on what's actually live for the person at that moment. But sometimes it will be sort of specific stuff about particular practices, but quite often it's around kind of the emotional side of this. So all sorts of bits of a person's story can begin to kick in and how that shapes their sense of spirituality, their sense of religion. And most of us have got a few dents in the bodywork as well. So there'll be places where there's odd bits of wounding in the past that play out. And sometimes that's a question of what's needed to enable that a journey of healing there. And sometimes it's a question of what's needed to let something in the past find its place in the past. And somehow where our sense of the spiritual, the religious kind of is sitting for us today. And I suppose in some contexts that might be relatively simple. I mean, some of my thinking's been shaped quite a lot by encounters with some of the Hindus in Bali in Indonesia, where amongst the Balinese, I think it's around about 97% of the population are Balinese Hindu. So although there's sort of variations from village to village, there's a sense of kind of everybody knows what it is and everybody's existing in relation to it. And I remember once somebody saying, it's actually quite hard to find a space for somebody to talk about it because it's a bit like asking a fish to talk about water. Mm. Whereas normally in the West, things are much more fragmented than that. So there's usually a really complicated pattern of the bits of story and the bits of experience that are shaped where a person is.
Yeah, that's a very appropriate comment, especially the sort of cultural context. And this, you know, and so if you're in a situation where everybody sort of knows what it is, it's like not really a question in a way. Maybe it's a refinement. And even if you're in a very kind of I'll call it Orthodox Christian, or any kind of Orthodox situation, at least the frame is set. As you know, Mark, we live in a pretty secular age. You're in the UK, I'm in the United States, where probably 50% of people are not overtly religious. So I'm curious if there's anything about this time that makes these kind of questions maybe more relevant or maybe richer, maybe different. I could see if I'm a Catholic, let's say, I may have very specific kind of questions that are based on my tradition. If I have no tradition, I'm starting from ground zero, maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a huge variation, because you get some people who will latch onto the word direction, and therefore will come and they're looking for either to be given the answers or to be given the answers that are consistent with their understanding of their tradition. That's always a little bit difficult, because in a sense they're after a safety net. And if you dig into most religious traditions, if you like, the insiders who've grown up in it are very well aware of the shortcomings as well. And so in a sense, they're a lot less willing to push a narrow certainty. But there's a huge richness in terms of what's going on for people in terms of how their own spiritualities have been shaped. I think very few of us are completely blank sheets of paper. Just as a silly and a helpfully extreme example, a few generations back, the family story at least is that one of my great-grandfathers was struck out of his mother's will for the heinous crime of emigrating from Scotland to England and joining the Plymouth Brethren, which I can sort of smile about at this distance. But I can remember when I was training in spiritual direction, the analyst I was going to encouraged me to read a book by Philip Goss called Father and Son, which recounts his childhood in a Brethren household in the 19th century. And I was astonished at the strength of my own reactions, as if something had been passed on without ever really being spoken about. And you think there's something in my spiritual DNA that's I needed to find out about, but I'm saying find out about it because, these days the Brethren are theologically pretty conservative. There's no question they'll be joining them. But nevertheless, there's a sense of something that's has shaped my being and shapes how I experience things. And I think for a lot of people, there's all sorts of bits of religious stuff around. If someone's grown up in a particular tradition and never left it, they might be like one of my Balinese friends and kind of completely within it. But most of the time, people have put a foot outside something, they've explored other things, and we end up as a bit of a mishmash. And there's something there about what's shaped that, both positively and negatively. And I suppose sometimes,
Go ahead.
I suppose sometimes I've come across people who've grown up in a particular tradition and then fallen out with it. And the sad part is that it sometimes feels as if the journey stops at the point when they've justified the decision to fall out with it. Whereas actually there's always a sense of something going on, something to explore. But maybe in order to explore, you have to actually assume that none of our traditions are perfect of themselves. Nobody's got the unique answer.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant because many people, for whatever reason, either they're not, they've fallen out of their sort of church that they grew up into, or they don't observe it anymore. That doesn't mean that it doesn't inform them on some level. And I imagine that's part of what, and that sort of brings us to the question, which is a sort of classic question, is that the difference between spirituality and religion. And I kind of know your answer. I've seen it, but anyway, briefly, give me your one-liner, your quick answer, because that's a very relevant question.
Absolutely. I suppose the one-liner is they're close relatives. The slightly longer version is that at one stage I kind of played with the definition that said spirituality is the raw material of an individual's experience. and religion is what happens when that gets organized socially, which is a very logical definition. And I kind of dumped it because I found that I kept tying myself up in knots because I kept wanting to tell people they were using the words wrongly. And I think the point is there's always a collective bit in our spiritual experience. But maybe if the focus is more on the individual spirituality in all its glorious chaos, and maybe religion is holding something that's more collective, which kind of, and that's it, the two are in conversation with each other. And I suppose I say that a bit cautiously because I've certainly come across people who would see themselves as spiritual but not religious. And there's just in my mind a question about that. It's almost tell me about the religion you're rejecting and why you're rejecting it, because often that's carrying something as well. There's often a wound in there that's shaped that, or a sense of not being heard. And as to be said, sometimes also a time when religious insiders have been too busy shoring up the institution to actually engage with the gloriously chaotic, messy reality of real life spirituality. But even that, I'd be a bit gentle because none of us could stand having our lives turned upside down by profound spiritual experiences very often. And so maybe a little bit of compassion for it sometimes being a bit dry is kind of necessary because actually there's stuff going on in the dry periods as well.
Now, probably many people listening to this have no idea that there is such a thing as spiritual direction, has kind of almost, at least in the Christian tradition, as a formal background, also always associated with Saint Ignatius, for example. I wonder if you could just sort of briefly sketch out your sense of as to basically what it is, but where it comes from, what its antecedents.
If I start with the very general thing, I think lots of people have found that their journey's been helped by conversations with others. So in one sense, there's something very general there.
Socrates and Plato.
Absolutely. And in the religious context, a word like guru has sort of mixed meanings. But in a sense, if you like, a good teacher is one who helps somebody else learn. And so there's always something there about enabling other people's learning and exploration. The specific term spiritual direction, in a sense, it goes back to Ignatius of Loyola. And he, there's lots of different views of him. He was the founder of the Jesuits. The way I would tell it is that at the time when he was born, he was an almost exact contemporary of Martin Luther. And there was some really big change going on. And he's, in many ways, he and Luther are very similar, but Ignatius being born in Spain and Luther being born in Germany, they end up on different sides of the Reformation. But both of them get interested in kind of individual experience. And for Ignatius, he comes up with the idea that actually, in addition to confession, you can actually do stuff with ongoing one-to-one conversations with people, which he sort of developed into the idea of a set of exercises and the idea that you can actually do stuff in the same way that you could exercise physically to get physically fitter, the stuff you can do to get spiritually fitter. And I'm saying this a bit guardedly because at the time that idea really caught the wind. A lot of people wanting to join the Jesuits. The process grew rapidly. So he actually, he wrote a set of guidelines for how to give the spiritual exercises, which are absolutely crystal clear that you tailor them to the needs of the individual. And in the text, he says it takes about a month to do this as a retreat. And there's historical sources saying he took anywhere between 2 and 6 weeks over it. So a lot of elastic and huge emphasis on the individual needs of each person. But within a century, that had turned into a strict 30-day retreat, which was 5 talks a day, with its delivered to a group. So it changed character enormously. And I think the idea of spiritual direction sort of picked up again in the early 20th century with the sort of beginnings of the retreat movement in Christianity. But then in the early 1970s, part of the fallout of the Second Vatican Council was all the religious orders were advised to go back and look at their foundation documents. And for the Jesuits, that meant it forced them up against the fact that the text of the exercises said it's a one-to-one experience and with lots of flexibility, and it was being given as 5 talks a day for a regimented structure. And so they started experimenting. And the reason for saying that is that the big thing that was in the background by then was the growth of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. So people were very used to the idea of in-depth conversations between two people. And in many ways, the revival of that one-to-one experience plugged into that much more secular one. Though I mean, I sometimes think psychoanalysis is another form of religion, and one shouldn't sort of discount its religious side. But that meant people got the idea that one-to-one conversations could help, and indeed, in the psychoanalytic world, it's absolutely normal for analysts to go to supervision. And one of the things that good spiritual directors also do is go for supervision. So in a sense, you're reflecting on what's going on with the people you're working with, rather than assuming you're always the one with the answers.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the tradition is so rich that to some extent, some people have almost divorced it from its historical context. In other words, like here's just something that's created that can be moved to different circumstances, different things, which have nothing to do necessarily with Catholicism.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful quote on that with somebody asking Ignatius who the exercises were for, and getting the answer, pagans, Protestants, and Catholics. Which, in the 16th century, that was everybody. And I remember one person with a much more conservative disposition spinning that as pagans and Protestants. If it was a pagan or a Protestant, you convert them first, and then there's a range of different readings. And for Ignatius himself, I think there are lots of parallels with Luther, and I think the Protestant-Catholic divide becomes a lot more rigid later on than it was in his time. So I think a little, but I find it useful to think of it as a time when people were beginning to think much more about individual religious experience, and that being something worth exploring.
All right, so we have this event coming up in June 17th that you're going to be facilitating. We're calling the Spiritual Path Exploration. What do you hope people to get out of it?
I hope they'll find it a fascinating experience. I mean, I'm expecting a range of levels of experience. So we might have some people who've never gone anywhere near anything like this, some who might run 1,000,000 miles from the word direction, through to people who might well be quite experienced. And I'm hoping what we'll have is a variety of people there, because in many ways you learn far more from talking to people who are in a different place from you than you would by talking to people who are in a very similar place. So I'm hoping we'll have a good variety. I doubt that anybody would come if they weren't actually interested in exploring their own journey. Quite often, people are a bit nervous to sign up for something a little bit like this because it feels a little bit too much of a leap. And I sometimes think that the caution itself is actually really important, because it's actually saying they think there's something of value going on for them. So I'm hoping for a variety. We'd be enriched if we have a variety of spiritual traditions involved as well. And I suppose the plea is to come into it with a sense of exploring rather than a sense of having the answer.
That's what our explorations are all about. And I'm for one, you and I have talked about this particular journey for a while, so I'm really looking forward to experiencing it myself as a participant. I don't have to lead anything. I just have to explore my own spirituality, and that's wonderful. Yeah, well, thank you, Mark. I'm looking